Welcome to Chapter 18.3, Radical Days of the Revolution. In 1793, the Revolution entered a frightening and bloody phase. The war with Austria was not going well for France. Some felt that the king was in league with the French enemies. Others wanted to restore the king's power. On August 10th of 1792, a mob stormed the royal palace, and radicals then took control of the assembly and called for the election of a new legislative body called the National Convention. Suffrage was to be extended to all male citizens, not just those who owned property, and the convention that met in 1792 was more radical than the earlier assembly. It voted to abolish the monarchy and establish the French Republic. Louis XVI and his queen were executed. War with other European nations and internal rebellions concerned the government, and the convention created a committee of public safety to deal with all of these issues. It had almost absolute power. Jacobin Maximilien Robespierre led the committee, and he was one of the chief architects for something called the Reign of Terror, which lasted from September 1793 to July of 1794. And during this time, courts conducted hasty trials and those suspected of resisting the revolution, and many people were the victims of false accusation. There were about 17,000 people who were executed by the guillotine. In reaction to the terror, the revolution entered its third phase. Dominated by the bourgeoisie, it moved away from the excesses of the convention, and the moderates created the Constitution of 1795. This set up a 5-man directory to rule, and a 2-house legislature. However, discontent grew because of corrupt leaders. Also, war continued with Austria and Britain. Politicians planned to use Napoleon Bonaparte, a popular military hero, to advance their goals. By 1799, the French Revolution had dramatically changed France. It had dislodged the old social order, overthrowing the monarchy, and had brought the church under state control. Nationalism spread throughout France, and from the city of Marseille, troops marched to the rousing new song that would become the French Revolution national anthem. Revolutions also made a social reform. Revolutionaries made social reforms. They set up systems to help the poor and to abolish slavery in France's Caribbean colonies. When Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were arrested and returned to Paris after trying to unsuccessfully slip out of France in the June of 1791, the monarchs of Austria and Prussia, in a declaration called the Declaration of Plinth, declared their willingness to intervene in France under certain circumstances. But the monarchs of Europe did not try to stop the revolution that was going on in France. When the National Assembly disbanded, it decreed that none of its members would be able to run for re-election in the new Legislative Assembly. This meant that when the new representative body convened in October of 1791, it had to be a completely different character. But the people that were elected were younger and less cautious than their predecessors. They were known as Jacobins, after the name of a political club that they represented. And they were passionately committed to liberal revolution. So in this supercharged kind of warlike atmosphere, there were rumors of treason of the king and the queen, and they spread throughout Paris. On August 10th, 1792, a revolutionary crowd captured the royal palace at the Tuileries after a lot of heavy fighting, and the king and his family had to run for their lives to the nearby legislative assembly, which suspended the king from all of his functions and imprisoned him, and called for a new national convention to be elected by universal male suffrage. The fall of this monarchy marked basically the second stage in the revolution, which was much more radical than the first stage. Angry crowds invaded the prisons of Paris and started slaughtering people that they found there. And they killed almost 1,200 in total. And it was a very horrible experience, and it just showed that the mob was really the one who had the most power in all of this. The Republic tried to create a new popular culture. They adopted a brand new revolutionary calendar which eliminated the saints' days and renamed the days and the months after the seasons of the year. They sought to redirect people's traditional religious enthusiasm for Catholic holidays and celebrations. And so they created new holidays that were secular. All of the members of the National Convention were Jacobins and Republicans. But there were the two groups that formed were led by, the Montaigne were led by Robespierre and another young lawyer named Georges Jacques Danton. When they led Louis XVI to be on trial, they voted and sentenced him to death by one vote on January of 1793. Louis died with tranquil dignity and on a newly invented guillotine. But French armies at first had a lot of success in their military endeavors throughout Europe. Everywhere they went, they occupied and chased away a lot of the monarchs or the monarchies of the other countries. And they found a lot of support among the peasants and the middle-class people that they were conquering. But the French armies also lived off the land, and they began eating the food of the people and the supplies and plundering the local treasuries. So the liberators started looking a lot more like invaders, the invaders that they were. And in February of 1793, the National Convention declared war not only on Austria and Prussia, but on Britain, Holland, and Spain. So the Republic of France was now at war with almost all the other European countries, and this great war lasted almost, more than 15 years. In the face of more military defeats and peasant revolts and different factions fighting for power, Robespierre joined with the sans-culottes and began governing the city in something called the Committee of Public Safety. And this was a committee that was given dictatorial powers in order to try to deal with the national emergency that was emerging. So Robespierre and his co-workers established a planned economy, and rather than let the supply and demand kind of determine the prices, the government set maximum amounts of prices for key products, and they weren't really strong enough to really enforce any of this price regulation, but they did fix the price of bread in Paris, and so now the poor could actually afford bread, and they only allowed bakeries to bake bread called the bread of equality, which is basically a bread made out of a mixture of all the available flours. White bread was outlawed, and pastries were outlawed because they were seen as frivolous. But the Robespierre's reign became known as the Reign of Terror, and it lasted from 1793 to 1794, and it was basically it used terror to solidify the gains that the revolution had made thus far, and so they set up courts where lots and lots and lots of people were tried without any evidence, and more than 40,000 French men and women were actually executed or died in prison during this time. And it was it wasn't even a full year, so the amount of executions that had to be done, basically the guillotine would have been going on 24 hours a day. It was an extraordinarily bloody time period. In March of 1794, to the horror of many sans-culottes, Robespierre's terror wiped out many of the original revolutionaries who had been criticizing Robespierre for being too soft on the wealthy. 2 weeks later, several of Robespierre's long-standing collaborators, led by the famous orator Danton, marched up the steps to the guillotine. There was a strange assortment of radicals and moderates and etc. in this group, and knowing that they might be next, they organized a conspiracy. They howled down Robespierre when he tried to speak to the National Convention on 9 Thermidor, which is actually July 27th of 1794, and on the following day it was Robespierre's turn to be, quote, shaved by the revolutionary razor. The National Convention abolished many of the economic controls that the Committee of Public Safety had put in place, and so they let the prices rise again sharply. But the collapse of economic controls, partnered with the runaway inflation, really hit the working poor very hard. And the common people of Paris finally revolted against this new emerging order in early 1795, and the convention had to use the army against the people to try to suppress the insurrection and make them stop fighting against the new government. In the villages and small towns, there also arose a great cry for peace and a turning towards religion, again, especially among the women. And as the frustrated government began to retreat on all of its religious questions from 1796 to 1801, the women of rural France brought back the Catholic Church and open worship of God. The war that had been continuously raging was not really as much about spreading revolution anymore as it was a means of meeting the ever-present and unsolved economic problems that France faced. Large, victorious French armies reduced unemployment at home, and they were able to live off the territories that they had conquered and were plundering. So widespread disgust with war and starvation and national elections of 1797 returned a large number of conservative and even monarchists to the government. The members of the Directory, fearing that they would soon be on the guillotine themselves, tried to nullify the elections and began to govern dictatorially. 2 years later, Napoleon Bonaparte ended the Directory in a coup d'etat and substituted a strong dictatorship for this weak one. He became the first consul of France.